So we're very grateful. You did a very, very comprehensive review of how to reform our foreign service. So we're very grateful you agreed to be here. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will proceed to questions from the members. Thank you, Senator.
Monsieur le Président, pour cette introduction chaleureuse et merci pour l'invitation.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Mr. Chairman. And it's a pleasure for me to be here today.
It's a busy house in there.
Before the committee, as a chair of the Senatorial Foreign Affairs Committee, to report back to your committee for our latest report, which was tabled in the Senate as of 6th of December, entitled More Than a Vocation, Canada Needs a...
Okay, we're live-ish. He's got a report written out there, and he's going to go on to it.
In-depth of examination of our foreign service was done in 1981 with the publication of the Royal Commission of Inquiry on the status of our foreign affairs.
Affairs Canada and the Canadian Foreign Service fit for purpose? Our answer is yes, but with several caveats. Over 16 meetings between April 2022 and June 2023, we were guided by 22 hours of testimony from expert witnesses ranging from current and former ministers, including one former prime minister, to retired practitioners, academics, younger serving officers, and members of employee-led networks within the department. The Senate committee also took productive fact-finding missions to Washington in December 2022 and to London, Oslo, and Berlin in September 2023. That's because several of our major allies, including Germany, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States, have also undertaken or are in the process of undertaking reviews of their own foreign services. We made 29 recommendations designed to strengthen the already considerable abilities of Canada's Foreign Service. The result of our study, launched in the Senate before the announcement of the department's own Future of Diplomacy review, is an excellent and comprehensive report. But of course, I'm biased. The Senate Committee's recommendations span areas including organizational structure and coherence, recruitment, career management, and conditions of foreign service. Among our concerns is staffing. The Foreign Service is still feeling the effects of a suspension in recruitment between 2009 and 2019. Recent events have also underscored the importance of a foreign service that can respond with agility to emergencies, including evacuating Canadians from conflict zones such as Lebanon, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Sudan, and Gaza. However, we heard that the department's surge capacity should be increased. That's why the Senate Committee strongly recommends that Global Affairs Canada run an annual entry-level Foreign Service officer recruitment campaign to fill vacancies and create that needed surge capacity. It should also recruit more mid-career professionals from other government departments and from outside government altogether. Our study revealed that generalist knowledge is prioritized over specific thematic expertise, due in part to some of the staffing challenges. Russia and China will continue to hold the world's attention for years. That means Russia and China specialists, people with understanding of the languages, cultures, and goals of these countries and governments, are invaluable. This is why the Senate Committee urges Global Affairs Canada to increase investment in foreign language training and provide opportunities for Canada-based staff trained in a foreign language to maintain their foreign language skills throughout their careers. This also speaks to our recommendation on the equal use of French and English within the department and to ensure that ab initio official language training is maintained for new hires. The conditions of foreign service could also be improved. The Foreign Service directives provide for allowances and benefits for staff serving abroad, and because they have not been reviewed since 1981, the Senate Committee strongly urges a complete modernization of the Foreign Service directives to ensure that they are adapted to the current and evolving realities faced by Canada's public servants. What happens around the world impacts us here at home, from economic security to physical security, and Canada's Foreign Service, through a broad range of duties, is at the forefront of mitigating negative impacts and taking advantage of opportunities. This goes to the heart of the committee's first recommendation, that Global Affairs Canada must do a far better job of communicating to Canadians what it and the Foreign Service specifically does. There is hard work ahead, and what the Senate committee recommended is not the end of it. We did not even get into costing issues.
What do they do
that
there?
Our talented people have the tools, skill sets, funding, and consistent nonpartisan political support to do their jobs. Again, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'll be pleased to answer any questions you might have.
So here is
Thank
a
you,
very, very
Senator.
limited
It was just brought to my attention that your mic is having some technical
difficulties.
problems. So if you would be gracious enough to use mic number 16, we'd be...
No one heard what I said?
No, we heard it all.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Chair.
Oh, imagine that. He had to say it all over his whole speech again.
Thank you kindly, Senator. So first up, we go to MP Poilievre. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Mr. President. Bienvenue.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome to our committee.
The report, and as you mentioned, that there's certain areas hasn't been tackled or wasn't tackled in your report. One of them is justice. And as justice is not referenced in Canada Future of Diplomacy discussion paper, what efforts should the department adapt, or the government adapt, to make sure that we uphold international justice and accountability efforts?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Poilievre. Could I just ask you to be a little bit more precise? By justice, do you mean legal services within the department, or do you mean public international law?
Public international law.
Okay. Well, thank you. You'll see that there is a recommendation there that the legal services provided in the department be retained. There have, over the years, been various ideas floated to have the Department of Justice handle these particular issues more directly. So, for example, extradition and issues like that. But I think as recent activity has shown, particularly with issues involving the International Court of Justice in The Hague or the International Criminal Court, it's of great value to have a functioning legal bureau, or in fact perhaps even more than one, because there are also trade lawyers in the department. It is a combined department, as you know, that handle legal questions that could come up in the context of negotiating free trade agreements. So I think those services are there, and there is also then, of course, a component that is consular in providing assistance.
You've also mentioned the surge capacity and the needs for extra tools, let's call it, or support needed. So, does the department have enough of those tools that could be useful to support further international justice and accountability?
Okay.
Do we have the tools?
I think the tools are there. I think they need to be refined, and I think there also has to be a way to ensure that when there is a crisis, if Canadians need to be evacuated out of Sudan, for example, out of Gaza, out of Israel, right after October 7th, that surge capacity is there. I go back a little bit to my own experience, if you'll indulge me, Chair. In 2006, I chaired the task force on the evacuation of Canadians out of Lebanon. And we learned a lot through that, because we could not, like the United States, send in the Navy to pick up our citizens. We had to get very creative, and we developed some best practices at that time that have been refined, including during the pandemic.
A recent article, I'm going to move in a bit of a different direction. Recent article talking about direct foreign investment in decline in Canada in the context of how much we lose in versus how much we're gaining. So we are in a net loss as far as that balance between what we invest outside and what gets invested in Canada. How do you see the future diplomacy role in making sure, first of all, we uphold to the balance or to the surplus, and the second is to examine. It's a concern, to be honest with you, if investments are not coming, international investment are not coming our way the way it should be. And I believe diplomacy has a role in this case. If you don't mind to
well, you're absolutely right. Diplomacy does have a role there, and in fact, the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service predates the creation of the old Department of External Affairs. It goes back to the 1880s. So at most of our missions abroad, and certainly at headquarters, there is a component that looks at trade promotion, but also at investment. And under the previous government, that was changed to make it two-way investment. So there is a dedicated core that works on that.
I have a final question. One of the recommendations from the witnesses on the report that called for establishing an ambassador for international justice. What do you think of that suggestion? Do you support it, yes or no, and why?
Okay, well, as you know, I'm not with the government, and at some point the government will have to respond to our report, and that is not one of our recommendations. And there's a reason why it's not one of our recommendations. I think, you know, you can have ambassadors, designated ambassadors for different functions. Climate change is a good example. In the past, there's been an ambassador for religious freedom and the like. But for justice, if you have, in my view, a functioning cadre of lawyers well versed in public international law and in treaty law and international humanitarian law, I don't see why you would need to have one person kind of covering all of this. It would be, I think, too much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we next go to MP Oliphant. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je commence avec un grand...
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to greet my students from St. Vincent. Pleasure to have them aboard today.
With us. We will be at our best behavior. Thank you, Senator, for being with us today. I've read your report. It's very helpful. It's a portion of our study on the future of diplomacy, because the human resources capacity is one portion. I want to ask a little bit about around the recommendation number 26, which is about rotational, non-rotational staff, which also gets us a little bit into generalists and specialists. And that balance between those people normally housed here in Ottawa, who become content experts or sometimes functional experts, versus those who are trained to go to the field and become experts at amassing information and doing the two-way bilateral relationship. Just wanted to give you a little bit of time to delve into that with me, to say what your learnings were around the advantages and disadvantages of having increasing staff here in Ottawa and decreasing staff in the missions, or where we should be focusing and how we could do that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Oliphant. As you noticed, we didn't make a specific recommendation on resource allocation. That is really up to the government, the minister and the department, as to how you want to do that. But I referred in my remarks to the 10-year dearth of new hires. So as a result, you have the average age of a Foreign Service officer at 47. And in my previous life, I started in my 20s. So it's very difficult to build a career or to focus on a generalist specialist thing. Moreover, because there were no new hires, there were a lot of hires that were brought in as temporary or in different occupational groups other than Foreign Service officers, who basically were doing Foreign Service officer work at headquarters. However, when it came time for an assignment overseas, they were overlooked because first priority was always for Foreign Service officers. So what has been created, what we heard from witnesses, is a type of caste system within the department. And it's complicated a bit as well, in that there are three occupational groups. So there are three unions that that represent people working in the department at the professional officer type level. So that is a difficult thing. And on generalists versus specialists, you do have niche expertise. Trade negotiators, for example, you have the development specialists that would have been separate in.
Le mauvais micro est ouvert pour le sénateur.
The incorrect microphone is not on for the senator. It's the other one next to him that's on. Now you have it. All is well. All is well. The right microphone is now on.
They're having technical difficulties with their microphones over there. Oh, here we go. Oh, there we go. They're back. Damn it. All right. Sorry about that.
That foreign language capacity current. So that means after assignment training to keep it up to foreign languages. So if a person wants to build a career with various assignments to China, for example, then you have to obviously invest in keeping that foreign language capacity current. So that means after assignment training to keep it up. So there are a lot of factors in there. The advantage on a generalist, and when I was in the Foreign Service, I was a generalist, but I had a Latin American phase, I had a European phase, did other things. The advantage is that generally a generalist will be more nimble, can adapt more quickly. But you will want some people who have a specialization who do not necessarily want to be managers, who do not necessarily want to be ambassadors. And there was an attempt a few years ago to create another Foreign Service category. This was the FS4, where the salary range then went into the EX1 category, but with the understanding that these were seasoned professional experts. And over time, that too has eroded. So I would recommend that in the internal review, and which of course you're part of, Mr. Oliphant, is to really have a look at that and see what makes the most sense.
Could I just ask about formation and education? And I come at this as a United Church minister where we had 6 seminaries across the country training people for the ministry in the United Church. The church and the academy worked hand in hand, differently but hand in hand. So the church had expectations given to the seminaries, and the seminaries had to respond. Freudian slip. What do you see as a perceived good relationship between our academic institutions in Canada and the preparation for and the recruitment of Foreign Service officers and others at GAC?
I often get asked that by the academic institutions, and once we launched the report, I went to the Norman Patterson School here and then to the Monk School in Toronto as well, and there are many young people who are eager to get in. The Foreign Service exam in the past, all you needed to do was to pass the exam and have Canadian citizenship. But the exam that was being offered was very much like an SAT, if you know what that is, or an LSAT, so very specific and would not take into consideration foreign language capability, niche expertise, if you're an economist or a lawyer, that sort of thing. And that's why we recommended looking at that differently, and also looking at mid-career exchange in and out. The department had a very successful academic exchange program for a while, where experts would come in and then leave. Jennifer Welsh is an example, but that goes back into the 90s, and that sort of enrichment would be great. So getting people in sort of mid-career and rotating them out. And the same thing with other government departments and agencies, or even the provinces. Every province has an international affairs component in its work. Every department has an international affairs directorate of some kind. Have more fluidity in terms of moving people in and out, and then you can select your assistant deputy ministers or deputy ministers of the future on that basis. That's why we have a direct recommendation to the clerk of the Privy Council in this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We next go to MP Bergeron. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mon tour de saluer.
Thank you. It's my time to greet the cadets from the St. Hyacinth Academy. I'm very pleased to see them. I was an instructor for the cadets, but Marine cadets for a number of years. Welcome to the Foreign Affairs and International Affairs Committee. Very pleased to meet with you again, Senator. And I join my praise for the excellence of your professional career, both as a diplomat, an ambassador, and a senator who is in fact chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate side. One of the recommendations of your report was that Global Affairs Canada, GAC, should ensure the equal use of English and French and maintain learning skills in both languages and extend the possibilities for language training to other employees and local people in the field. Certain bureaucrats who should generally have a bilingual status, however, given their pay grade, they avoid the exam or the test. And quite often, the upper echelons of the Mandarinate do not share a complete knowledge of both languages. What message does this transmit to our international partners? Thank you very much for those questions, and thank you for your elegant praise initially. Well, when we recruit, we should ensure, as I said, in initio, both possess full knowledge of both and capacities in both official languages. As for the francophones in the department, for the notes given to ministers, for the policy papers, generally speaking, they work in English. However, there is a rather shortage of language skills at the upper echelons. Very often, deputy ministers do not have to be language tested annually to ensure that they're maintaining their bilingual skills. We should be working on that, of course, and this is why we made that recommendation in our report. Are you satisfied with the reply that you got from government? Not yet, because we've approved a report in the Senate and needs to be followed up. A further recommendation that the Government of Canada should ensure that the upper Mandarinate, including deputy ministers, should have a good comprehension of international affairs. That's a bit frightening to hear that type of recommendation, to think that deputy ministers or assistant deputy ministers don't have a full grasp of international affairs. Well, I'll have to tread lightly here. The 4 deputy ministers currently have a rich experience, an in-depth, even for that of international trade as a portfolio. He worked at finance for a number of years, G7, G20. But there have been cases in the past where the deputy minister or the deputy ministers in the plural did not have this experience. And, of course, it's important to have this knowledge to work in a network structure with other diplomats. We make friends with our counterparts in other countries, and over time, years usually, and as they rise in the ranks and seniority, they do absorb that knowledge. I have contacts with certain colleagues which I have maintained over the years. Recommendation 22, JC should recognize the significance and value of employees hired in the field and provide exchange possibilities. We were quite surprised a few days ago that after the deportation or the exclusion of certain diplomats from India, that we didn't think of perhaps hiring more locals. Do you think that's appropriate not to have increased the number of local employees after rejecting a couple of dozen diplomats from India? Well, I can only share a personal opinion on that. Those who are hired on site are very, very important, as much as the people we hire for the government here. But each country is different because usually they are nationals of another country, although we do have Canadians with double citizenship. But each case is judged on its merits. For those recruited locally, we insist on having loyalty to Canada. Even if they're living in another country under a different legal regime, we have to take a very close examination of the opportunities that may arise to improve their careers, continue developing professionally, and perhaps give them a pathway to becoming employees directly of the department. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Boehm. It's been very interesting to have you here. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for that report. I think it was very useful. In fact, I think that you did a lot of the work that we may be repeating in this particular study. So thank you for doing that, and certainly I read it with great interest. I also want to welcome our friends here into the chamber with us. One of the questions I wanted to ask about, it came up this weekend. You know, this weekend was obviously a pretty challenging place around the world, but one of the things that was on the CBC News was that Canada is very quickly becoming irrelevant in sub-Saharan Africa. Totally irrelevant is, in fact, what the quote in the news was. We had said that there would be an Africa strategy that has not come out, and that there was a note that our failure in terms of diplomacy, development, and trade in the region meant that we were ceding much of Africa to other countries like China and Russia. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that from that diplomatic standpoint.
Sure. Well, I'm delighted that you would pick a quotation that was taken from a committee that I was chairing. So we have embarked in the Senate on an Africa study, and I know that work is going on within the department. I know that Mr. Oliphant is directly involved in that, but we thought it would be useful to look at that. So we're going to do a deep dive. We have just started, and as you know, with your own background, it has to be more than official development assistance. We have to look at countries that may have slipped back during the pandemic, and see how trade, investment, and other things can be increased. And at the same time, there's been an increase in activity by countries that don't necessarily follow the ODA rules that have been established for by everyone else. Of course, China and Russia are the examples. So sub-Saharan Africa, difficult part of the country. I know from my previous life in our bilateral discussions with France, there was always a lot to talk about. But when you get into things like putting troops on the ground and international peacekeeping force and the like, it can get very complicated.
Well, Canada's quite diminished in peacekeeping as well. in the region, well, all around the world, but in Africa in particular.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can certainly make that argument. But the point is, if you look at the demographic trends in Africa, as you know, it's going to be exponential in terms of population, in terms of need, and that there is a real role for Canada there. And I would add too that we are in a unique position in terms of two smaller organizations, the OIF, the Francophonie, and the Commonwealth, where we are the second largest contributors, at least in terms of our dues, not necessarily in terms of voluntary contributions, but that kind of puts us into a special position that could be utilized as well, in my opinion.
Well, and from my perspective, too, I mean, I know I have a different opinion than many people within global affairs, but I did not believe that it was particularly good for our diplomatic and our development portions of our foreign affairs to have global affairs all be in one place, because I do feel that trade has trumped the ability of our diplomacy and our development to take that meaningful place within our foreign policy. It's been something that I've seen for a long time that worries me about that. I know you've spoken that there are some real benefits to having it in one place, and I'm sure there are, but there is obviously things that are lost if we don't recognize the value of diplomacy and development as well as our trade relationships. And Senator Boehm, I hope you'll forgive me. I'm gonna move a motion now, because this is what we have to do when we want to move things. So thank you for being here. I am going to move the motion, and that will probably take the rest of my time. But I read your report with a lot of interest, and I do thank you for coming before the committee. So, Mr. Chair, I will be moving the motion that I distributed to the committee on February 5th on military goods and technology exports to Israel, and I will be asking for a recorded vote on that if I could. Now, the motion that pursuant to Standing Order 1081A, and given the value of military goods and technology exports to Israel from Canada have exceeded $21 million in 2022, and that there were 315 utilized export permits and a further 199 authorized for military goods and technology to Israel reported in the 2022 report on the export of military goods, the committee order Global Affairs Canada to produce all documents, briefing notes, memorandums, and emails within the department, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs office, and between the department and the Department of National Defence, the Canadian Commercial Corporation, the Privy Council Office, and the Prime Minister's Office related to the granting of any export or brokering permits for military goods and technology to Israel between 2020 and 2024 within 30 days of the adoption of this motion, and that these documents be provided to the committee without redactions except to protect cabinet confidences. So obviously this is something I'd like us to vote on right now, and I'm happy to speak to it, but basically to say that this committee had a similar request a few years ago regarding Canadian military exports to Turkey that resulted in important information that was made public, and a study by this committee that led Canada to suspend military exports to Turkey, an action that we of course have seen reversed this month. I have another motion on arms exports to India that I will be moving at another time. I have been asking for clear answers on military exports to Israel for a long time. I have not been able to get any accurate answers, including a order paper question in which I received two of the identical answers to two very separate questions. I have received more than 250,000 emails into my inbox on this issue, and I would like us to have a recorded vote on this motion. Thank you.
Yes.
Could I ask that we suspend the meeting for 5 minutes for us to have a little caucus about this, because we
many of the motions and much of the work that we brought forward. In fact, 4 months, as my colleague Mr. Bergeron has pointed out. Now, that said, everything that we have done, we gave this on the notice paper on February 12th. I read this in for the committee. This is a motion that has been there. I'm sorry that some members of the committee were not ready to vote on this. We made it public. We told you it was coming, and then I tabled it in the way that is according to the rules, our standing orders, our standing rules. This is exactly how it's meant to be done, and I'm sorry if some members don't like that, but I would like this motion, which I brought forward using the tools that I have as a member of this committee. I'd like it to be resolved. I'd like it to be voted upon. Thank you.
Anyone else want to speak to this? Did we?
Mr.
Yes,
Chair.
MP Chateau.
This is a motion I put forward for the future of diplomacy, and I had questions for the senator that are very important to me because I want to do a comparative analysis, which Heather, Mr. Chair, my colleague prevented me from having more meeting on the comparative study of the future of diplomacy. So, look, I'm in favor of the suggestion by Mr. Chong. I think we should return to the study and move quickly. We have 2 small amendments, and it shouldn't be, we shouldn't be wasting more time. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, MP McPherson.
Could I understand, if it's already on the floor, do we not have to deal with the motion? Is that not, in fact, the rules of this committee?
But someone could bring a point of order on that. Yes. So yes, you're correct. It is before the committee. So did anyone else want to speak to this? Nope. Any amendments? Is that? Yes.
It's on the floor, and we are largely in favor of this. We think it's an important issue to be discussed. However, we would have 2 amendments. One, when it says 2020 to 2024, we would back that to 2006 and 2024. So make it a longer term motion. And also at the end, these are 2 separate amendments, but I'm going to put them into one, which is a little bit risky. You can decide on that once I've said them. And following cabinet confidences, add to protect cabinet confidences, respecting privacy legislation, and protecting sensitive commercial interests.
How far down would that be?
That's right at the end, right? At the last word it says, except to protect, without reductions, except to protect cabinet confidence is one, respect privacy legislation, and protect sensitive commercial interests, which is standard language around export permits.
Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
J'aimerais, Monsieur le Président, que les 2 propositions d'amendement.
Chair, I would like to see that these 2 proposed amendments be treated individually. I'm in favor of the first, and I disagree with the second. I disagree with the second because we've already seen, in fact, when there was sales to Turkey, when we received their representatives before we decided to undertake our study of exports of military goods to Turkey. It was just far too easy for the officials to cite this as a cover to not appear before the committee. Now, it was very, very frustrating to undertake that study at that point, but we wanted to launch this study because we weren't getting answers from that, and we, of course, need some of this information from time to time, confidential, commercial, or not. We don't want to give anyone a pretext to fail to divulge information. We've lived the experience, so I'd vote for the First Amendment. But I'm strongly opposed to the second part, the Second Amendment.
My colleague, Mr. Bergeron, I support the First Amendment. I think that is a strong amendment, and I would take that as a friendly amendment. The second one, the respecting the privacy, I think makes a lot of sense. But the protecting commercial interests, when we are talking about weapons that are currently have killed over 12,000 children, I think we can go ahead and waive that.
So may I propose that we deal with the first one first and then move on to the second one? So, insofar as Mr. Oliphant's amendment concerning the dates are concerned, did anyone want to speak to that, or did we want to go to a recorded vote?
I'll just say I find it a little ridiculous that we'd go back all the way to 2006, but we're not opposed to it.
So everyone is unanimously in favor? Okay, so the First Amendment is adopted. As for the Second Amendment, is everyone clear on what the Second Amendment is? Yes, can you kindly read it one more time?
Without redactions except to protect cabinet confidences, respect privacy legislation, and protect sensitive commercial interests. Let me just say that under our legislation with respect to any arms export permits, we will always have commercial interests are protected. That is part of it, but I want to be very explicit about that because it is part of our system. But that's not unusual. It is related to the fact that we don't give the names of companies who may have competitors. We are always careful. That doesn't mean we don't talk about the actual products, but we don't name commercial interests because that can put a Canadian company at risk in a variety of ways. And that puts jobs at risk. That puts management jobs and labor union jobs and all kinds of people at risk. So we will still get the same information, but we will be protecting commercial interests.
Mr. Bergeron.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, if that's the current practice, I don't see the necessity of having a belt and suspenders. So I would like to strike out that final part only of the proposed amendment.
You want to strike out the privacy aspect of it,
No.
or the confident?
The sensitive commercial matching.
Sensitive commercial.
Interests. Sensitive commercial interests.
Yep. Yes,
I will still speak in favor of it, partly because what we're doing is this is a request for papers, and what we're trying to do is give instructions to those people who are bureaucrats or officials, either working with the Privy Council office to do it. So we are trying to give them the best advice we can on what to do. They will, of course, follow all laws. They are obligated to do that. But I think by making this extra clear, we're respecting their work on this, and I think it's important. I think it's an important principle as well that we acknowledge that there are commercial interests that we need to protect, as well as lives of people around the world if there's any misuse of these things. So we'll still be supporting that.
So Mr. Oliphant, just so I understand, in the absence of this caveat, it is your opinion that they would not actually protect confidential proprietary information?
I have no idea. I'm just making it perfectly clear that the committee our expectations are that we would share those interests and those concerns. So just making it clear. I can't predict what the bureaucrats will do. That's their job. They're officials and they're under the law. I just don't know, but I'm just trying to make it explicit.
Okay. So you want to put it to a vote as is?
I'm not changing it.
On va d'abord devoir voter sur le sous-amendement que j'ai proposé.
Well, then you'll have to deal with the sub-amendment to the amendment that I am proposing, Mr. Chair, first.
Est-ce que c'est juste
So just given the complexities that would be involved, I think we should vote the entire thing and then revisit it with what everyone considers. Because if that was the friendly amendment or the sub-amendment that you have proposed, it would throw the meaning of the entire sentence into a tizzy.
Je regrette, Monsieur le Président, la procédure usuelle, c'est qu'on vote d'abord.
Well, we always procedurally vote for the sub-amendment, then the amendment, then the motion itself, whether modified or not.
Another way, but sure, if you insist. So the sub-amendment, yes, Mr. Chung.
Just for our edification, can you tell us what the sub-amendment is, please?
Yes. Could you read the sub-amendment? Well, Danielle, can you, sorry, Madam Clerk.
Protective, sensitive commercial interests.
Yep. So the sub-amendment is simply, let me read the entire sentence and then I'll tell you what is the sub-amendment. So it currently reads that these documents be provided to the committee without redactions except to protect cabinet competences, respect privacy legislation, and protect sensitive commercial interests. And Mr. Bergeron is proposing that it only read, these documents be provided to the committee without redactions, except to protect cabinet confidences and to respect privacy legislation. So he is in favor of eliminating and protect sensitive commercial interests.
The sub-amendment is to strike the
eliminate,
words.
Yes. Strike, protect sensitive commercial interests. And protect. The and is there too. Yep. On division.
So we, just to clarify, Mr. Oliphant had a motion for the whole clause.
Yes.
And sorry, amendment for the whole clause, and then Mr. Bergeron's sub-amendment is to strike and protect sensitive commercial interests.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm in favor of Mr. Bergeron's sub-amendment.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, what?
We are. Yeah.
So we are, the committee, it seems to me, in the majority.
Yeah, everyone is in. Yep. Okay, so that's been struck. And now the actual amendment.
Yep.
Do we want to put that to a vote, or is everyone unanimously in favor? Yeah, we are fine, actually. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so now we're going to put the motion to a vote as amended. Unanimously agreed to? Okay. So now we will resume hearing from our witnesses for 2 minutes.
In Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Myanmar, a list that goes on, stand as wrenching testaments to the failures of our so-called international rules-based order, with devastating consequences for millions of civilians. Unprincipled use of vetoes at the Security Council block decisive international action. International human rights and humanitarian laws, always contested and challenged, are brazenly flouted like never before. The ambit of your study is considerable. I'd like to focus on 3 points. Bolstering Canada's global capacity to champion human rights, improving implementation of our own international human rights obligations, and bringing consistency and equal treatment to consular protection. First, to be a global human rights champion requires much more than saying we are one. Just over 75 years ago, adopting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, states recognized a universal truth, namely that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Yet we live in a world in which the rights and dignity of entire peoples are utterly disregarded, as we are seeing right now with Palestinians in Gaza. I can think of no other ambition and imperative that should more profoundly shape Canada's diplomatic capacity than universal human rights protection. Canada regularly declares itself a global champion of human rights, and there have certainly been high water marks over the decades and dedicated efforts of individual Canadians, which are truly commendable. But there has been little tangible evidence of Canada's leadership as a nation for many years now. It's been 25 years since such Canadian accomplishments as establishing the International Criminal Court, banning landmines, and protecting child soldiers. I would suggest we sorely need a mandated international human rights strategy and action plan that would establish transparent standards to ensure consistency in our human rights efforts across the globe, would treat all human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, equally, and would set and appropriately resource clear priorities such as supporting human rights defenders, uniformly pursuing justice and accountability, and advancing women's human rights and gender equality. Second, our contribution to global human rights protection starts with upholding international human rights at home. In a world in which states regularly disregard their human rights obligations, Canada should set an example, but we do not. A consistent concern in UN reviews of Canada's human rights record is the lack of an effective process coordinated across federal, provincial, and territorial governments to implement international human rights in Canada. Canada was examined under the UN Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review process for the fourth time in November. As they did in 2009, 2013, and 2018, a significant number of countries, 25 this time, called on Canada to ratify a 22-year-old torture prevention treaty, the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, which we have been telling the UN we are considering doing for 18 years now. When Canada reports back to the UN next month, we will likely again hear that Canada is considering ratification. That will frankly again be received as empty words. This domestic human rights gap undermines our human rights diplomacy. A recently established Federal Provincial Territorial Forum of Ministers on Human Rights is intended to make progress on this front, but has been a deep disappointment. It has had little guidance from global affairs, and it needs it. Finally, you are reviewing this committee's November 2018 report regarding consular services. The first and I believe most important recommendation in that report was for the government to carry out a review to ensure that, quote, Canadians are not subject to arbitrary treatment or discrimination in the provision of consular services. In August, I joined a civil society delegation to Northeast Syria that included Senator Kim Pate, retired Canadian Ambassador Scott Hetherington, and immigration and human rights lawyer Hediat Nazami. We were able to access some, though not unfortunately all, of the Canadian men, women, and children who have been unlawfully detained in harsh conditions in camps and prisons there for the past 7 years, without charge, without trial, without access to lawyers, without contact with their families, without any means of challenging the reasons for their detention, and without any consular visits. Our delegation was deeply distressed by what we heard, including health concerns and inhumane detention conditions. 13 Canadian children are held in an overcrowded, dangerous detention camp where they are not going to school, are living in fear, and have been told that the Canadian government would be willing to bring them back to Canada, but not their mothers. This is a clear instance of the provision of consular services that is both arbitrary and discriminatory. I implore you to call on the government immediately to provide in-person consular support to these vulnerable and abandoned citizens, more than half of them children, and arrange for their repatriation to Canada. Everything about how these cases are being handled betrays a commitment to the universality of human rights. That runs contrary to what the very essence of Canada's diplomatic capacity should be all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neve. Very grateful. We now go to Mr. Party for his opening remarks. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
and your kind invitation today, and given the fact that I'm into my 9th decade here, I mean, these invitations are very rare indeed, so I very much welcome this one. And of course, this is a very different world than when I was born in 1939, and my mother was always would always remind me that there were 2 very important events that occurred in 1939. So that's one she would use all the time. The timing of this study, of course, is those of us involved in diplomacy around the world and trying to see how we fit into governments that come and go and this sort of thing, and with significant changes in policies and approach. And I think having a study of such of this nature on the capacity of diplomacy, it's generally overlooked when we look at foreign policy. We tend to look beyond whether or not we have the capacity to do so. But of course, capacity will determine whether we're able to protect and project the interests of Canada into the world. I came, as the Senator mentioned earlier, Peter and I were colleagues in Central America for a number of years together, chasing the wars down there. And I became a member of the Foreign Service in '67, and it was still in the afterglow of Pearsonian diplomacy, but the agenda was changing in that particular period beyond our ties with the United States and with Europe and into the new world created by decolonization and the self-determination by people. The empires have largely disappeared. They were there very much in place in 45. But in 1945, when sovereign states got together in San Francisco in creating the United Nations, there were only 52 countries. Today, there is 193, and that in itself gives us a magnitude of the issues. And I would suggest to you, the way the world is today, that it will not be long before probably we have 200 sovereign members of the United Nations. But in that sense, I think as an issue that gets overlooked as far as foreign policy is concerned as Canada, I would hope that the committee would note specifically that the Indigenous people of the world, they remain a matter that will increasingly involve our international attention. And it's not one. Canada, along with Australia, New Zealand, and the United States a few years ago, mistakenly opposed a UNGA resolution on Indigenous people. And that, I think, was one of the more serious mistakes that Canada has made diplomatically in recent years. But as Peter mentioned, when I came to Ottawa in the 60s, there was Canada-wide recruitment for the Foreign Service, and public interest was exceptionally high, where it was not uncommon for somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 people would apply for the number of jobs that were available. But today, we're into the age of contract arrangements and entry from other parts of the government, and that in itself, as Peter noted, it carries its own problems. And then equally over this same period, the name changes. We were first external affairs, and then we were foreign affairs, and today we are global affairs. And then the associated functions of trade, immigration and refugees and development were included within that body. Immigration and refugee function has returned to its domestic home, but as you all will note, that those issues associated with immigration and refugees are as much part of foreign policy today as anything else that we want to do. All foreign ministries around the world have undergone similar structural transformations and struggle to find a balance, if you like, in terms of how to meet the needs that those functions require. But the recruitment is still the main issue here, and I'm glad that the committee asked Mr. Boehm a number of questions about the report that he was an author of, in terms of how do we recruit and who do we recruit. But in effect, there is a set of characteristics that I think would be essential in terms of Canadian representation in other countries. And of course, this is the question of knowledge. There is aptitude, there is language acquisition abilities, and of course, there's always personal flexibility. And these capabilities, while not necessarily unique to the Foreign Service, are essential for the persons required to provide the services that Canadians need internationally. And of course, there is, as I mentioned, in terms of the personal suitability, the changing Canadian mosaic that we are dealing with. The issue that has come up in any number of my colleagues of dual career families, and in terms of how they can adjust to, in effect, a rotational life in the Foreign Service. But I would also add a cautionary note for you to keep in mind that large international events, including the conflicts that we're dealing with, have a daily, if not an hourly, effect on Canada's diplomatic activity. Today, global communications are faster than the proverbial speeding bullets, and no foreign ministry has the time for reflection before action is often required. But I would also mention as one issue that needs, I think, that should give the committee some caution here, and these are the elections that are going to occur in the United States on November 5. And as we all know, and if we watch the news at all, the political and social divisions in this, our most important relationship, have never been as extreme as they are today. Equally, there are the aspects of this reflected in our own elections and political system. What is unique is that these divisions have an existence.
Ask you to wrap it up in the next 20 to 30
And in
seconds.
the United States, no one has been able to do any sort of forecasting as far as what's going to happen on November 5. So it's going to be one of these open agendas that's going to haunt us, I think, for the next 10 months. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Party. We now open it up to questions from the members. Each member will be provided 3 minutes. Mr. Epp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Canada's presence on the world, and we've had several witnesses come to this committee on this study and testify to our diminished status on the world stage. Certainly, Mr. Neve talked about human rights, advocating for human rights. Our Prime Minister's lecturing of the Italian Prime Minister, our Deputy Prime Minister's tweet of the Saudis, those have all had fallouts. Other witnesses have come, we have to repair and restore our image. So would your recommendations be that Canada further engage in multilateral institutions, for more on bilateral or minilateral? Or what would be your recommendations on restoring our image so that we are more effective? And perhaps you take issue with the premise of my question, which is Canada's place in the world. If you have comment on that, by all means. Let's start with Mr. Purdy, and then I'll go to Mr. Neve.
I would agree with any comment that relates to the fact that we don't have the status that we had, 40 or 50 years ago. And it's not necessarily what we do in that world. The world has changed so dramatically during that period that the expectations of the rest of the world, in effect, does not necessarily include what Canada has on offer. So whether or not, in effect, we can address that, I think through our staffing means or through where we have embassies. We are tied to a very defined foreign policy matrix. We are an ally of the United States as far as North American defense is concerned, and as far as outer space is concerned. We are a member of NATO, and we are a member of the United Nations in all of its manifestations. So I don't think there's a lot of choices that we can make of either going one way or the other. You've got to do it across the board, and I think most countries try to do this. How much you can do in this kind of an atmosphere with the resource base that we got is the question.
Mr. Neve?
So I too would share the concern that indeed our standing and the things we're achieving concretely as a nation with respect to human rights are not what they once were. And I think an answer to your question is to bilateral, multilateral, what kind of strategies? It's all of the above. And that's why I made the recommendation that we truly do need to get into the habit, and I think it should be mandated by law, to develop an international human rights strategy and action plan and keep it updated. Other countries do that, and that's exactly the approach that gives us the opportunity to make sure that all of the pieces fit together, the multilateral engagement, the bilateral interventions, even the moments of lecturing. I agree that sometimes lecturing can be counterproductive. Other times it's exactly what is needed, including a well-timed tweet, and even when it provokes a negative reaction. But when that's not part of a comprehensive action plan and strategy, I think we risk it being bits and pieces and not having a comprehensive agenda and strategy behind it.
I would love to follow up with more questions, but obviously the time is.
So, MP Al Gabri, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses. Mr. Neves, good to see you. And Mr. Party, great to have you here. I will focus my questions to you, Mr. Party, because I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about consular services, which I know how passionate you are and how influential you have been in this regard over the years. And because of the limited time, I'll ask 2 questions at once. The first question is, there's been movement to prescribe a service standard for consular. Yet, we also understand how important it is that consular officials have flexibility in how they pursue each case. How do you balance these 2 priorities? And the second question is, do you think the consular division has enough resources? Thank you.
Certainly on the service standards, I wrote the first set of service standards for the consular function back in, I think, 1994. I mean, it's still there. It's through various iterations and this sort of thing. And by and large, I think, and I would make the comment, and I follow this area fairly closely. I've been retired 20 years, by the way, and there's been a lot of things that have gone on. And one of the things that I have noticed in following the media is that I think this is one area where the Department of Foreign Affairs or Global Affairs Canada has been doing reasonably well, even in a situation such as Gaza, which is as difficult as one can imagine in terms of helping Canadians in difficulty, given the variety of actors and interests that are involved here. But yet, my understanding is that we've got somewhere over 600 and maybe close to 700 Canadians out of Gaza in the last few weeks. So not bad. So there is a system there, and I think on the resourcing side, the problem that you get into are whether or not you need a surge capacity in this area, because for the exceptional ones that come on, we never had a surge capacity, and all we had to do, what we usually do, is to pick and choose. But the thing to remember about consular services, Canadians pay directly for this service. You mean it is paid for by the people who buy a Canadian passport. They spend a $25 fee. The government, when it was that was on a 5-year passport. When the government went to a 10-year passport, it did not increase the fee in accordance with roughly $5 a year, which is what we implemented back in 1996. But as a result of that particular fee, I can tell you that the governments over the years have made money out of this consular fee because the consular services have cost less than the money that was collected through this fee. Yeah.
Thank you. We now go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 3 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour, messieurs.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, gentlemen. Glad to see you again. Mr. Neve, I agree with you on the fact that Canada is really not playing, it's playing underweight, if you will. But most unfortunately, it's at the expense of women, children who are dying in detention camps in Syria. And I certainly hope that Canada will finally decide to act progressively. First question to Mr. Purdy. November last, there was a meeting of the 3 mayors who decided to have Canada work in this strategic zone. at that conference, Canada was questioning itself as to the role in that type of forum. Our discussions in dealing with the superpowers, we have to multiply multilateral relations. And the response from JC was quite interesting. In 2018, you appeared before a committee that greater flexibility should be used to deal with intermediaries to release hostages, for example. Now, the process that the government is organizing itself to try to save the life of one of its citizens. Now, in comparison with multilateralism, do you think things have changed in 2018 as to the kidnapping of Canadian citizens abroad?
On hostage taking, as you know, it's been in the post-war period. You mean the number of incidents that have occurred have been tremendous. Period that I was there dealing with them, I was told when I retired 125 hostage situations that I dealt with, and not one Canadian died. I operated on the principle that ransoms in these situations are going to be paid. Now, there has been international agreements by the G7 and other groups, that sort of thing, who say ransom should not be paid, and it's absolute nonsense. Every member of the G7 and just about every other country in the world, when faced with hostage situations, work out some sort of an arrangement, in effect, to get their people back. We had a very tragic situation a few years ago in the southern Philippines, that those two people should never have died. If you take the situation more recently as far as China was concerned, the two Canadians in jail in China were hostages in every sense of the word, and in effect it was well within the power of the Canadian government to work out an arrangements for their return. And we've done it in other situations, but for some reason or another, we have lost how to do this. Or will not, the people who work the system will not take the flexibility that's available and the flexibility that is available and get your Canadians back alive. It's quite doable.
Thank you.
Every other country are able to do it.
Thank you. For the last question in the last 3 minutes, we go to MP McPherson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here today. It's very, very interesting to me. Alex, you talked a little bit about having a international human rights strategy. We tried to bring that forward, that amendment, during Bill C-281 last spring. It did not pass, which was disappointing. You also talk a lot about Canada's, role in the world, and what I wanted to ask you about. You look at Syria, where we have different, we treat different Canadian citizens different than other Canadian citizens. You look at, our arms strategy with cluster munitions, where we're not there any longer as a leader in disarmament. And then you look at things like the ICJ, like you look at how our response to the ICJ and the ICC is very different when it happens in certain contexts than it is when it happens in other contexts. And I'd like you to comment on the reputational risks that is to Canada, what this actually means when the rest of the world is watching Canada and see that we apply human rights, we apply citizenship, we apply international law differently in different contexts. What are the implications of that?
Thank you for the question. I think the implications are very grave. No, I say that not at all naively suggesting that the world is awash with many other countries that have a stellar record. Obviously, we can look across the planet and find many countries that are similarly pursuing foreign policy in ways that are contradictory, hypocritical, undermining and ignoring universal standards. But I think we have always expected and demanded and seen much more from Canada. And I think some of the examples you've highlighted, all of which are quite recent or even contemporary, playing out right now, the the approach we've taken to the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and the vital role that those two global institutions should be playing in helping to tackle the impunity that is at the heart of what's happened in Israel, Gaza, coming from a country that has always championed those two institutions, is noted. It's certainly noted by other governments. It's noted by global civil society. It's noted within the UN. And it is not to our credit. And that will not serve us well, be it with respect to what to ensuring that our voice is heard with respect to Israel, Gaza, but it will have reverberations more widely as well.
Thank you. And Mr. Party, did you want to comment on that as well?
No, I fully agree with Alex.
Okay. Well, you know what, Mr. Chair, I think that's good. I have 10 seconds left, so I'm prepared to cede.
Thank you very much. That concludes questions by the members. Allow me to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Neve and Mr. Party. We're very, very grateful for your expertise.